Like many horror games out there, the boss fights of Resident Evil are some of the most terrifying and iconic boss fights seen in video games. I don't know what it is about the franchise, but holy fuck, it seems like the bosses get bigger and bigger with every single game. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, we'll be taking a look at some of the biggest motherfuckers in the series as I give you guys the top 10 largest monsters of the franchise. Before we get started though, know that there's not a ton of information on these creatures in terms of their actual size. A lot of my rankings on today's video is completely based on what I visually see, any information I can find on the size of these monsters, and how they compare to different structures and people around it in order to get an idea of how big they actually are. But with that out of the way, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is the top 10 largest monsters of Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Giant Alligator, Resident Evil 2. RE2 and its remake includes many boss fights against William Birkin and even Mr. X. However, one boss fight that stuck out in the original game was the giant alligator. While investigating the sewers as both Leon and Claire, the players will come across a giant alligator infected with the T-virus. And thanks to the T-virus, this giant alligator has become one of the biggest monsters seen in a Resident Evil game. According to information that I have found out about this monster, it stretches to about 32 feet long. That's pretty insane. And you can definitely see how big this gator is, thanks to it pretty much filling up the entire room it fights you in. For the record, it does appear in the remake as well, but you don't really get to see the entire gator as it's pretty much chasing Leon throughout the sewers. Still, it's fair to assume that it's just as big as the one in the original game based on how big the mouth of the creature is when it attacks Leon. Number 9, Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 Remake.
Look, just so you know, this is the last fucking time.
Most forms of Nemesis in both RE3 and its remake are nowhere near the size it needs to be in order to crack today's list, but there is one form of Nemesis that stands out as being significantly bigger than any other form. That of course is Final Stage Nemesis in RE3 Remake. While there's not a full explanation about how big this giant fucking blob is when comparing him to Jill's height, it's pretty clear that he's one big motherfucker. In fact, this Nemesis is so big that the only way that Jill can finally put it down once and for all is by using a railgun that's literally the same size as she is. Of course, the size of this beast and its extremely long reach is exactly why beating it on Inferno is such a massive pain.
Come on! Next time, take the fucking hit!
Number 8, V-Complex, Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles.
But you forget that when you look into the depths of the abyss, it swallows you whole.
Darkside Chronicles is a game that I really don't talk much about, mainly because I'm not the biggest fan of on-rail shooters. But honestly, there's a lot of interesting moments in this game. And one of those interesting moments is Operation Javier. Teased in Resident Evil 4 before Krauser and Leon fight, Operation Javier was a mission that the two rivals went on together prior to the events of RE4. On this mission, they came across one of the biggest monsters of the franchise, V-Complex. This creature is a giant Veronica plant, yeah, as in T-Veronica virus, that combined with the scenario's main villain, Javier Hidalgo, to create V-Complex. Perhaps this monster feels bigger than it actually is because of the first person perspective, but holy shit, watching this thing tower over you is terrifying. Number 7, Uroboros Aheri, Resident Evil 5.
Albert! What the hell?
Farewell, old friend.
being betrayed by Wesker, Excella is infected with Uroboros, and after mutating, she combines with a giant pile of corpses to become Uroboros Aheri. This giant monster is so big that she's able to push out tentacles that are long enough to reach over a cargo ship, or a freighter I think it technically is. In fact, Aheri becomes so big that the easiest way to put her down is by using some sort of weapon that kind of reminds me of the Hammer of Dawn from the Gears of War franchise. Because the player fights with her as she's floating just outside of the freighter, it's kind of hard to get an idea of how big this monster really is. But taking into consideration how tall the boat is and how long the vines of this creature are, I believe it's safe to say that she definitely deserves a spot on today's list. Number 6, Lago, Resident Evil 4. Honestly, the most difficult part about this list is ranking monsters that mostly hide themselves underwater. Yet clearly the underwater monsters tend to be the biggest ones of the franchise. Like Lago for example. This is the biggest monster in Resident Evil 4, and it's basically just one giant salamander-like creature swimming around in a lake. However, since the entire boss fight takes place on a lake, Lago hides underwater for most of the encounter. Therefore, the only time we can actually get an idea of how big this monster is when it jumps out of the water to attack Leon. It's here where we can clearly see how big this monster is. Now, I'm not 100% about the size of the monster, but from what I can find online, it seems that this creature is around 65 feet long. 65 fucking feet. That's insane. Number 5, Ricardo Irving, Resident Evil 5. What do you know, another aquatic monster on today's list. Again, like I've already said, trying to identify how big a monster that mostly hides underwater is kind of difficult. Still, I can't imagine that Aheri is bigger than Irving after taking everything into consideration. First off, the core of Irving's massive mutated form is pretty big on its own, as it gives Lago a run for its money. Yet, unlike Lago, Irving also has multiple tentacles stretching out of it that appear to be coming from the surface of the ocean floor almost. Again, we don't exactly know the size of this squid monster, but when combining the size of its tentacles with its core body, then it's clear that Irving, at the very least, is bigger than Lago from Resident Evil 4. Number 4, Derek Simmons, Resident Evil 6. Derek Simmons gives Nemesis a run for his money in terms of how persistent this guy is. Seriously, he just keeps coming and the player has to fight him multiple times in multiple different forms. However, his largest transformation is of course his final form, which takes the form of a giant fly. Now, if you've never played this game, then I'm sure you're probably like, there's no way a giant fly could be bigger than some of the other entries on today's list. Well, I give you the ultimate giant fly because this thing is at the very least the same size as King Kong, probably even bigger. Just standing next to it as Leon makes you feel extremely small. And what's even more shocking is that it's not even the biggest monster in this game. Number 3, Eveline, Resident Evil 7.
I just wanted a family.
Eveline is the main antagonist of Resident Evil 7, and she's the final boss of the game, but she's definitely not the hardest boss of the game. In fact, she's one of the easiest bosses of the entire franchise, which is kind of shocking considering that she's also in the top 3 biggest monsters of the franchise as well. After confronting Eveline at the end of the game, she first morphs into a giant blob thing with a face, so basically she's William Birkin 2.0. But in her second and final form, Eveline becomes a massive chunk of mold that can rework itself and stretch itself across the battlefield. In fact, she's so big that she's able to carry Ethan all around the entire Baker estate and stretch high above the trees. Again, we don't get the full picture of how big Eveline really is, but just from the bits of her that we saw, she's definitely in the top 3 biggest monsters of the franchise. Number 2, Haos, Resident Evil 6. Start off by saying that I am truly sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but let's be real, guys. You guys know I'm horrible at pronouncing words. Anyways, I don't know what it is about RE6, but for some reason Capcom wanted to go big in the most literal way possible. The Ogremon, Derek Simmons, and now Haos and Chris's campaign. But before talking more about Haos though, I do want to clarify something. The next 2 entries are really interchangeable, as both Haos and the number 1 entry make a strong case for being the biggest monster of the franchise. Ultimately though, I'm going with the Haos that we saw, and what we did see of it wasn't its full potential. Essentially, Haos had the ability to become extremely massive. In fact, the Haos that we saw at the end of Chris's scenario is actually a fucking infant. Yeah, it's a newborn baby. Imagine if this thing made it to the surface and grew to its full size, because this thing would make any monster look tiny once it became a full adult. Fortunately, they stopped it before that happened, and from what we did see of it, I don't think it was enough to surpass the number 1 entry. Still, Haos in Resident Evil 6 is massive and definitely deserves the number 2 spot on today's list. Number 1, Malacoda, Resident Evil Revelations.
This is Hat-Trick, do you read?
Extraction is not possible at this time. I'll execute a holding pattern. Hat-Trick out.
The largest monster of Resident Evil from my perspective is the Malacoda in Revelations. More commonly known as the whale monster, Malacoda is so big that it can completely wrap around an entire cruise ship, which by the way is roughly 1,000 feet long. Now, I'm not trying to say that the Malacoda is 1,000 feet long. Actually, from what I've read about it, most statistics say that it's between 250 to 300 feet long. I really went back and forth between Malacoda and Haos for the number 1 spot, but ultimately I went with the monster that statistically had more odds of being bigger than the other, and for that reason Malacoda claims the number 1 spot for largest monster of the franchise. So that's it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is the Malacoda the largest monster in Resident Evil, or is there a different monster that you think deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that like button if you really enjoy this topic, and subscribe for more survival horror content like today's video. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.